Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video, and welcome to my discussion for March's chapters of Bleak House in my ongoing Victorian-style serialised read-along. So if you don't know, I'm currently hosting a serialised read-along of Bleak House, where we read Bleak House in the original serialised monthly parts as it would have been published in the Victorian period. So we're now just over halfway through. The read-along will be finishing up in September, and today I'm going to be discussing the chapters that we read in March. Chapter 39, Attorney and Client, Chapter 40, National and Domestic, Chapter 41, In Mr. Tulkinghorn's Room, and Chapter 42, In Mr. Tulkinghorn's Chambers. So, many interesting things to discuss today. As usual, I will go through the chapters that we've read, what happened in them, and then talk about some kind of points of interest from those chapters. So, Chapter 39, Attorney and Client. In this chapter, we are introduced further to Mr. Vholes, and we see Mr. Vholes and Richard in Mr. Vholes' office discussing the Jarndyce and Jarndyce case. We see how Mr. Vholes is kind of turning Richard a little bit more against Mr. Jarndyce, and we see how Richard is kind of sinking further into despair and frustration at how little is done and how little moves along in his law case. And in the second half of the chapter, we also see Mr. Guppy and Mr. Weevil / Mr. Jobsling, who observe Richard Carstone and think to themselves that it would be much better if he were well out of Jarndyce and Jarndyce. Guppy goes to Mr. Crook's shop to see Mr. Smallweed, and who should he encounter there but yet again Mr. Tulkinghorn. Mr. Tulkinghorn makes a few knowing comments about Mr. Guppy's friends in high places, referring to the fact that Mr. Guppy knows or has had some dealings with Lady Dedlock, and Mr. Guppy swears to Weevil that he is going to give up all of this business whatsoever, going to give up all of the research as he promised to Esther that he would. So, points of interest in this chapter. Let's firstly talk a bit about Mr. Vholes and his general character and how he is supposed to be presented, because Mr. Vholes, on the one hand, comes across as a somewhat slimy individual, a little bit like Harold Skimpole, except that Mr. Vholes is kind of keeping his family afloat, and while he does reference his daughters and father quite often that he has to support, he also, like the character of Neckett, Charlie's father, who we encountered early on before his death, he's someone doing a kind of unpleasant job, but who does have to provide for his family. Yet at the same time, you do see the way Mr. Vholes kind of pushes Richard further into his depression and desperation, and the way he kind of really fuels Richard's dislike of Mr. Jarndyce. Mr. Vholes is a very respectable man. He is not a large business, but he is a very respectable man. He is allowed by the greater attorneys who have made good fortunes or are making them to be a most respectable man. I want to talk about the way Dickens uses this, because it reminds me quite a lot of the way he describes Bradley Headstone in Our Mutual Friend, and often Dickens describes characters who are eminently respectable, and who are so respectable in appearance and so respectable in reputation that you kind of know they're not respectable in their heart, if you see what I mean. This is quite interestingly done, and whenever Dickens uses phrases like that and repeats very respectable, most respectable, it makes it feel ironic. And it reminds me of Mark Antony's speech in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, when he says, you know, when he talks about people being honourable men, and says it so many times that you're like, you're not saying they're honourable men anymore, are you, Mark Antony? That's what that kind of passage makes me think of a lot. While Mr. Vholes may be considered respectable by the law, Dickens certainly doesn't think that the law is respectable, and we have more critique of law in general in this chapter. Dickens says, "The one great principle of the English law is to make business for itself." I want to look a little bit at Richard's dialogue in this chapter, because you really do see how more he is kind of sinking into despair. It's interesting to note that in this chapter, like, the majority of his dialogue has exclamation marks and question marks at the end of it rather than full stops, kind of showing how uncalm he is. Again, nothing done, says Richard, nothing done. And when Mr. Vholes says, "We have put our shoulders to the wheel, Mr. Carstone, and the wheel is going round," Richard says, you know, but I have no money left. It's no good for the wheel to be going round if I'm not going to get anything out of this. And you do see how kind of low Richard has sunk. Richard says, "Put yourself in my case, dragging on this dislocated life, sinking deeper and deeper into difficulty every day, continually hoping and continually disappointed, conscious of change upon change for the worse in myself and of no change for the better in anything else, and you will find it a dark-looking case sometimes, as I do." It's really sad, because Richard kind of knows that he's gone wrong, and that everything is a mess, and that he is in debt, and that he is becoming a less good person than he was, but he also doesn't know how to get out of it without the case being solved. It's the only way he can see for him to escape the cycle he's gone into, which is, it's pretty sad. I find Richard's plotline in Bleak House like one of the most interesting in the novel, and it's really, really well done, I think. And we see Richard's anger when Mr. Vholes mentions Mr. Jarndyce, and we see how Mr. Vholes has pretty successfully turned Richard against him. If any man had told me when I first went to John Jarndyce's house that he was anything but the disinterested friend he seemed, I could have found no words strong enough to repel the slander. I could not have defended him too ardently. So little did I know of the world. Whereas now, as you declare to you that he becomes to me the embodiment of the suit, that in place of its being an abstraction, it is John Jarndyce, that the more I suffer, the more indignant I am with him, that every new delay and every new disappointment is only a new injury from John Jarndyce's hand. Richard, now knowing the case better, knows that the more money he might get from the suit, the less Mr. Jarndyce would get, and therefore believes that Mr. Jarndyce must be his enemy, because the only thing he really cares about, or the only thing he kind of lives for now, is the suit. And it's important the moment when we see Richard kind of from the outside and see what Guppy and Weevil think of him, who are likely to put it in less kind of softened terms than Esther when she sees Richard, because Esther loves him like a brother and they do not really know him. Mr. Weevil says to Guppy, "There's combustion going on there. It's not a case of spontaneous, but it's smouldering combustion it is." "Ah," says Mr. Guppy, "he wouldn't keep out of Jarndyce, and I suppose he's over head and ears in debt." It's interesting, I think, to note how that moment of spontaneous combustion of Mr. Crook is a kind of embodiment of the theme of combustion or like self-destruction throughout the book, and the idea that Mr. Crook kind of drank himself to explosion, oh my god, and that Richard is kind of destroying himself from the inside too. I think the only other thing I want to talk about in this chapter is a little bit about the interaction between Mr. Tulkinghorn and Guppy, and just about Tulkinghorn in general in this chapter. When Mr. Weevil and Mr. Guppy come into Mr. Crook's shop, Mr. Guppy starts at seeing Mr. Tulkinghorn standing in the darkness opposite with his hands behind him. There's something quite sinister about Mr. Tulkinghorn kind of lurking in corners, and also because Mr. Guppy is kind of aware that Mr. Tulkinghorn knows that he has had something to do with Lady Dedlock, and Mr. Guppy doesn't know what he might know and what he might think. And it's interesting too to note Mr. Tulkinghorn's effect on Guppy by a very few words when he says, "You are to be congratulated, Mr. Guppy. You are a fortunate young man. High friends, free admission to great houses, and access to elegant ladies." And Mr. Guppy immediately becomes very flustered, very flushed, and starts kind of defending himself at length, though Mr. Tulkinghorn remains very calm throughout, and it's his kind of calmness that makes Guppy so nervous and makes Guppy quite worried, which I think is very powerful too. So I think that's mostly what I wanted to say on that chapter, so let's move on to chapter 40, National and Domestic. In this chapter we learn that there is no parliament currently, and that the country is in slight disarray, and we also follow the Dedlocks down to Chesney Wold, where Lady Dedlock is again rather out of sorts, and where Mr. Tulkinghorn once more turns up. We learn that Sir Leicester is backing a candidate for election that is up against Mr. Rouncewell, the ironmaster, the son of their housekeeper who've met before. Sir Leicester is very annoyed, especially to hear that Walt Rouncewell has been assisting his father in this election, and that makes him think that he's maybe not suitable to marry a young woman that Lady Dedlock had taken a fancy to. And then Mr. Tulkinghorn begins to tell a story, which he claims is about a townsman of Mr. Rouncewell and a situation, but is actually, in fact, the true story of Lady Dedlock's past, with a imaginary future about Rosa like being removed from Lady Dedlock. So, points of interest in this chapter. I think mostly the most interesting thing in this chapter is kind of Mr. Tulkinghorn's story, and him finally like showing his cards to Lady Dedlock, as it were. But I think there's also quite a lot of interesting things about class in this chapter too. So the first thing I want to talk about is about Mr. Tulkinghorn's class and where he fits in, because there's a few quite interesting things that Sir Leicester Dedlock says about where Mr. Tulkinghorn kind of fits into the system. When Volumnia suggests that Mr. Tulkinghorn has been worked to death over the election, Sir Leicester says, "I don't know why Mr. Tulkinghorn should be worked to death. I don't know what Mr. Tulkinghorn's engagements may be. He is not a candidate." Sir Leicester says, "Mr. Tulkinghorn is always welcome here and always discreet wheresoever he is. A very valuable person and deservedly respected." One of the Dedlock cousins suggests that he must be an enormously rich person, and Sir Leicester says, "He has a stake in the country, I have no doubt. He is, of course, handsomely paid, and he associates on a footing of equality with the higher society." It's interesting to note that Mr. Tulkinghorn, although he is nominally on a footing of equality, like the way Sir Leicester talks about him is also quite condescending, both in the kind of modern sense of condescending, and also in the Victorian sense of condescending, which means to like condescend to someone, but it wasn't considered a negative thing. Like if you ever read like the word patronise or condescend in a Victorian novel, it doesn't necessarily mean negatively. Very interestingly, it didn't have the same connotations then. And it's interesting to note how Sir Leicester very much separates and puts a distance between Mr. Tulkinghorn and himself. Mr. Tulkinghorn is respectable and rich, and he can associate with them in society, but he is also someone in their employ, as it were, and so that kind of changes the footing between them. And it's also interesting in terms of class that for Celesta Dedlock, it's a real affront that Mr. Rouncewell dares to kind of be active in an election against him, because as far as he views it, he employs Mr. Rouncewell's mother, and therefore, like, Mr. Rouncewell should have some kind of loyalty to him, which of course Mr. Rouncewell doesn't have, and it's partly because Celesta views Rouncewell as being so far beneath him. Upon my honour, upon my life, upon my reputation and principles, the floodgates of society are burst open and the waters have obliterated the landmarks, the framework of the cohesion by which things are held together. For Celesta, the kind of increasing social mobility in the Victorian period is like a real affront, and he finds it like really distressing, to the extent that he believes that Mr. Rouncewell and his son are like now dangerous people that they should keep Rosa away from. And when Mr. Tulkinghorn remarks that people like Mr. Rouncewell are proud in their way, Celesta says, "Proud?" As though he cannot believe that people who are from like the middle classes could be proud, because for him pride is something that belongs to people of his class. And now I want to discuss the story that Mr. Tulkinghorn tells. Interesting, of course, that twice he like pretends to ask for Lady Dedlock's permission and then tells a story that she would definitely not like to hear. A townsman of this Mr. Rouncewell, a man in exactly parallel circumstances as I am told, had the good fortune to have a daughter who attracted the notice of a great lady. I speak of really a great lady, not merely great to him, but married to a gentleman of your condition, Celesta. The lady was wealthy and beautiful, and had a liking for the girl, and treated her with great kindness, and kept her always near her. Now this lady preserved a secret under all her greatness, which she had preserved for many years. In fact, she had in early life been engaged to marry a young rake. He was a captain in the army, nothing connected with whom came to any good. She never did marry him, but she gave birth to a child of which he was the father. The captain in the army being dead, she believed herself safe, but a train of circumstances with which I need not trouble you led to discovery. As I received this story, they began to make an imprudence of her own part one day when she was taken by surprise, which shows how difficult it is for the firmest of us, she was very firm, to be always guarded. There was a great domestic trouble and amazement, you may suppose. I leave it to you to imagine, Celesta, the husband's grief. But that is not the present point. When Mr. Rouncewell's townsman heard of this disclosure, he no more allowed the girl to be patronised and honoured than he would have suffered her to be trodden underfoot before his eyes. Such was his pride that he indignantly took her away, as if from reproach and disgrace. And this story that he tells is, of course, Lady Dedlock's story with a new future. And it's very interesting to note that this is, I think, the only time that we fully hear Lady Dedlock's story and her past with Captain Horden. We know that there were letters between them, and we now know that she was engaged to marry him, but that they did not marry, but she gave birth to his child. And the way that Mr. Tulkinghorn says the captain in the army being dead, it's not clear whether he died before they could get married or whether they separated and then he died afterwards. I think this is one of the only bits where we get like proper facts about Lady Dedlock's past, and even then I suppose we're being told it within a partly fictionalised story, so we don't know how accurate what Mr. Tulkinghorn is saying. Though it's certainly enough for Lady Dedlock to realise that he knows her story, and in this story it contains not just him laying his cards on the table saying that he knows this story and that he knows about her, but he also is showing the shock of those around her to what is actually her situation. And also it's a kind of veiled threat, well, not even really veiled, it's a threat of the fact that Rosa might be taken away from her, and the fact that he frames it about a girl similar to Rosa suggests that he knows how strong Lady Dedlock's attachment is to Rosa, which, as I kind of mentioned before, I think is very much a kind of surrogate-daughter relationship, partly because she can't know her own daughter, so she takes this girl under her wing, who she is very fond of, and who acts to kind of fill that hole in her heart. So I think that's all I wanted to say on that chapter, so I'll move on to chapter 41 in Mr. Tulkinghorn's room. So in this chapter, Mr. Tulkinghorn retires to his room at Chesney Wold, where Lady Dedlock comes to visit him and to confront him. And now, knowing that he knows her past, she is prepared to leave Chesney Wold at once, to fly and to abandon where she lives, to run away and kind of hide from the shame, because she believes that he is about to reveal it. But he tells her that in fact he is not about to reveal her secret to the world, because for him what matters, his only concern, is Celesta's kind of family reputation and the name and honour of the Dedlocks. So for him, he wants to do whatever will serve the Dedlock family best. He has no personal consideration for Lady Dedlock at all, not that much even for Celesta. It's all about the kind of family honour and the family name. So therefore, Mr. Tulkinghorn instructs Lady Dedlock to do nothing and to continue to do nothing until she receives any sign from him that she ought to do anything. So that places her entirely in his power. And that's basically what happens in this chapter. It's pretty much one scene, one very important, significant conversation. So points of interest in this chapter. There's plenty to talk about. One thing I want to talk about before I talk about the actual dialogue is the kind of characterisation of Mr. Tulkinghorn and Lady Dedlock. We have this interesting paragraph at the beginning. There is an expression on his face as if he had discharged his mind of some grave matter, and were, in his close way, satisfied. To say of a man so severely, strictly, self-repressed, that he is triumphant, would be to do him as great an injustice as to suppose him troubled with love or sentiment or any romantic weakness. He is sedately satisfied. I think that's really telling of the kind of person Mr. Tulkinghorn is. He is repressed and emotionless and cold and calm to the last. He is someone who is satisfied rather than triumphant. And also it's interesting, of course, that again, Dickens kind of takes us one step back from Mr. Tulkinghorn. He says there is an expression on his face as if, which is quite interesting phrasing. And we get this quite a lot when Dickens writes about Tulkinghorn, that he doesn't fully get inside Tulkinghorn's head. He always brings us like back a little bit to show how kind of unknowable this man is, which is something I think is really cleverly done. And yet there is a moment where he is, his calm and his resolve is kind of shaken a little bit, which is when Lady Dedlock turns up at his room, because he did not expect that. He doesn't expect to be challenged. The blood has not flushed into his face so suddenly and readily for many a long year as when he recognises Lady Dedlock. And Lady Dedlock, in fact, much like Mr. Tulkinghorn, is presented as this kind of unreadable character. She's another person that Dickens draws back from a little bit. There is a wild disturbance. Is it fear or anger in her eyes? And that is partly Mr. Tulkinghorn looking at Lady Dedlock and not being able to read her, and it's partly Dickens saying this is such a complex kind of character and personality that it is both fear and anger, and it's hard to tell which. I really like the conversation and the dialogue here between Lady Dedlock and Mr. Tulkinghorn. I think it's one of like the great scenes in this book, especially the kind of very like brief sentences that we have here. Lady Dedlock, it was necessary for me to inform you that I knew it. How long have you known it? I've suspected it a long while, fully known it a little while. Months? Days. And when Lady Dedlock explains that she intends to leave Chesney Wold tonight and to go this hour, Mr. Tulkinghorn tells her not to. What? Not go as I have said? Do you know the relief that my disappearance will be? Have you forgotten the stain and blot upon this place, and where it is, and who it is? No, Lady Dedlock, not by any means. And then he says, the relations between us are of an unfortunate description, Lady Dedlock, but as they are not of my making, I will not apologise to them. The position I hold in reference to Celesta is so well known to you that I can hardly imagine but that I must have long appeared in your eyes the natural person to make this discovery. Lady Dedlock, I have not yet been able to come to a decision satisfactory to my mind on the course before me. I am not clear what to do or how to act next. I must request you, in the meantime, to keep your secret as you have kept it so long, and not to wonder that I keep it too. The sole consideration in this unhappy case is Sir Leicester. I have no occasion to tell you that Sir Leicester is a very proud man, that his reliance upon you is implicit, that the fall of the moon out of the sky would not amaze him more than the fall from your high position as his wife. Your flight, Lady Dedlock, would spread the whole truth, and 100 times the whole truth far and wide. It would be impossible to save the family credit for a day. It is not to be thought of. When I speak of Sir Leicester being the sole consideration, he and the family credit are one. Sir Leicester and the baronetcy, Sir Leicester and Chesney Wold, Sir Leicester and his ancestors. I have much to consider. This is to be hushed up, if it can be. And later, and this is I think a very telling speech about Mr. Tulkinghorn, my experience teaches me, Lady Dedlock, that most of the people I know would do far better to leave married alone. It is at the bottom of 3/4 of their troubles. So I thought when Sir Leicester married, and so I have always thought since. No more about that. I must be guided now by circumstances. In the meantime, I must beg you to keep your own counsel, and I will keep mine. And Lady Dedlock says, am I to drag my present life on, holding its pains, at your pleasure, day by day? She asks, still looking at the distant sky. Yes, I am afraid so, Lady Dedlock. And I think this chapter is really powerful for showing how far Lady Dedlock is now in his power, and how Mr. Tulkinghorn slightly enjoys that, and also how Mr. Tulkinghorn, despite his very cold, calm, professional exterior, is quite intrigued by Lady Dedlock. Like, he's kind of impressed by the power that she has to repress her emotions, partly because he is a man who likes to repress himself in many ways, and so he's kind of slightly impressed by the fact that she does that too. And it's really interesting to note just how strongly she is in his power here, and just how much that almost destroys her and upsets her even more than the fear of discovery, the knowledge that she is discovered and that she has no idea what will happen and when anything might happen next. There's a couple of interesting paragraphs at the end of this chapter I'd like to read as well, which I think are quite telling about Mr. Tulkinghorn and Lady Dedlock as characters. Mr. Tulkinghorn opens both the doors exactly as he would have done yesterday, or as he would have done 10 years ago, and makes his old-fashioned bow as he passes out. It is not an ordinary look that he receives from the handsome face as it goes into the darkness, and it is not an ordinary movement, though a very slight one, that acknowledges his courtesy. But, as he reflects when he is alone, the woman has been putting on no common constraint upon herself. He would know it all the better if he saw the woman pacing her own rooms, with her hair wildly thrown from her flung back face, her hands clasped behind her head, her figure twisted as if by pain. He would think it so all the more if he saw this woman thus hurrying up and down for hours without fatigue, without intermission, followed by the faithful steps upon the ghost walk. But he shuts out the now chilled air, draws the window curtain, goes to bed, and falls asleep. And I think that's all I want to say on that chapter, so let's move on to chapter 42 in Mr. Tulkinghorn's chambers. In this chapter, we're back in London, as is Mr. Tulkinghorn. And Mr. Snagsby goes to see Mr. Tulkinghorn to tell him that Mademoiselle Hortense has been like hanging around Snagsby's shop, which is annoying Mr. Snagsby, especially because his wife is becoming like weirdly jealous about it. So he goes to explain this to Mr. Tulkinghorn. And later in this chapter, Mademoiselle Hortense comes to see Mr. Tulkinghorn and is very angry with him because she thought that he was going to find her a place in someone else's house as a lady's maid, and he has not. And she is furious. And she is even more incensed when Mr. Tulkinghorn says that if she bothers him again, he will have her put in prison. And she is very, very furious with lots of anger. So, points of interest in this chapter. One thing I think is interesting to note is Mr. Tulkinghorn's kind of dismissal of women. He says, "These women were created to give trouble the whole earth over. The mistress not being enough to deal with, here's the maid now. But I will be short with this jade at least." It's interesting. I think it would be accurate to say that Mr. Tulkinghorn is a misogynist, but I think he also kind of thinks very little of all people, not just of women, and in fact what he thinks highly of is kind of family credit and honour and kind of tradition and the symbols of tradition rather than actual individual people. He dismisses Lady Dedlock, he dismisses Hortense, but he's also fairly dismissive of the men around him as well, people like Mr. Guppy. The conversation between Mademoiselle Hortense and Mr. Tulkinghorn is quite interesting, especially as we see this kind of clash between two quite dislikable figures. Mademoiselle Hortense is a really interesting character, especially in her kind of fiery nature and in her very quick displays of anger. At times there is a suddenness in the manner of Mademoiselle Hortense, so like a bodily spring upon the subject of it, that the subject involuntarily starts and falls back. And she says to Mr. Tulkinghorn, "Sir, you have not used me well. You have been mean and shabby. You have attrapped me, catched me to give you information. You have asked me to show you the dress of my lady must have worn that night. You have prayed me to come in here to meet that boy. You paid me 2 sovereign. I have not changed them. I refuse them. I despise them. I throw them from me. I am not yet placed. Place me well. Find me a good condition. If you cannot, or do not choose to do that, employ me to pursue her, to chase her, to disgrace and to dishonour her. I will help you well and with a good will. That is what you do." She says, "I am rich. I am very rich in hate. I hate my lady of all of my heart. You know that." And what she wants is to kind of be involved in the bringing down of Lady Dedlock in some way. And she knows there's some mystery there. She knows there is something against Lady Dedlock, but she doesn't know what, and she wants to be involved. Mr. Tulkinghorn threatens to perhaps put her in prison if she comes again, and tells her to turn a new leaf and think twice before bothering him or Mr. Snagsby again. And Hortense leaves furiously without answering him or without looking back, and that is how we end that chapter. So I think that's all I wanted to say on those 4 chapters. 4 interesting chapters with lots of dramatic dialogue and conversations going on. So in the month of April, which is already well underway, I know, I'll hopefully have that video up at some point before the middle of May. In the month of April, we will be reading the following 4 chapters. Chapter 43, Esther's narrative. Chapter 44, the letter and the answer. Chapter 45, in trust. And chapter 46, stop him. Lots of drama to happen there. And that is all. Thank you very much for watching. Please let me know if you read March's chapters of Bleak House and what you thought of them, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.